Paula? Okay.
Yes.
So I think what I'm really going to do is just try to be as quick as possible. And just to speak for a minute about Javeed, Dr. Sukhera, you know, for those of you that haven't met him, on the bio, the brief bio, you can see that he did his undergrad up in Canada, University of Toronto, did medical school in Israel, did his adult and child at Rochester training, and then got his degree in education, or I'm not sure the details of it. He can tell you about it if you want, in the Netherlands. So, and then was working in Canada, up in London, Ontario, which is near Toronto, where in addition to all of his academic work, which you'll get a sense of if you don't know him yet, he was a real figure in the community, contributing in many ways, including being the president of the policing board for London, Ontario, which is a several 100,000 person city. So the chief of police actually reported to him in that role, and I don't know if he counts as an early career person, but I think of him that way, has had an outsized impact, and I think has incredible momentum in making change in the world. And his being here, I think, is no accident. I think his, the way he's, the trajectory of his own development and life's work, and the history of this place, the Institute of Living, and the recent history of, the transformation and pivoting to sort of the next 200 years. It's like when there's a saying about when the group is ready, the leader will appear, and that's what I have in mind. That's what it feels like with Dr. Sukhera being here. And now to know that Mike Dewberry, and I'm just going to say briefly, Mike, that I would very much include you as part of what I was saying before, that this is no accident that Javeed is here, that the two of you working together as a team has been just amazing to watch, and amazing even more to watch you, set the tone and the groundwork ahead of that, and your capacity to have equanimity in a way that I wish I could, and help everybody, move in the right direction, and do it sort of hand to hand and heart to heart. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Sukhera.
Thank you. So thank you for the intro. Thank you everyone for being here. I am really excited for today. It's going to be a different kind of Grand Rounds. And so starting off, make sure you register your attendance. The code is 25622, and it expires 120 minutes after the end of this activity. I also want to make sure that I cover disclosures, to highlight that there's no conflicts of interest, and that the planning committee has nothing to disclose. So here we are. It is a winter afternoon in the year 2022, not too dissimilar from a winter evening 200 years ago, where just down the road from where we sit at the IOL, a group of men generally met and talked about a vision, a dream. What we're going to try to do today is Mike and I are going to chart a little bit of why you're here, challenge you to think about your relation as it relates to this organization, but to the work that we do in general. I'm going to share a bit about why I'm here, and Mike's going to share a bit about why he's here. And then we're going to speak collectively about our role in co-designing a future for mental and behavioral healthcare. So let's start with some quiet reflection. And I'm going to ask you to quietly reflect to yourself what the concept of moral treatment means to you. You can jot it down, You can make a mental note of it. You can type it in your little yellow notes app in your device. But I'm actually going to pause for 2 whole minutes for you to reflect. All right. So now I'm going to share a little bit of my journey with you all. In preparing for this talk, I read and reread a lot of different things. And in one of the books I read, there's a quote from John Greenleaf Whittier, who was the editor of the New England Review. And this was a description of Eli Todd. And he said, the superintendent physician's task is an arduous one. It's a task for the angels. So I'm here along with many of these men in these pictures, one of whom hopefully is here with us today, because this is for me an opportunity beyond what one would call an opportunity. I'm not here because this is about a career or about academics or about my work as a physician. I'm moving and uprooting my family from a place of comfort because I truly believe that we at the IOL at this moment in history have a chance to do something amazing. Something that can cause and inspire a complete paradigm shift in terms of how we deliver mental health care in America and across the world. But I wouldn't be fully honest if I didn't share with you that I am also someone who might be a little bit different from a lot of my predecessors. I might be different in visible and invisible ways, but I also might be similar to many of them. I might be similar to Eli Todd, who in his experience of having a dear loved one struggle with severe mental illness, began to appreciate why personal and professional were intertwined. I might be similar to Charles Burlingame, who had a vision of integrating research, education, and clinical care. And I might be similar to Hank Schwartz, who was and is a fierce advocate against the prejudice and discrimination that is so commonplace for so many of the people that we serve. I'm also here because I, throughout my career, for personal and professional reasons, have always been anchored to service, particularly for people for whom systems aren't designed to treat them with dignity. And I'm also here because I have my own experiences of vulnerability, of trauma, my own human experiences and human emotions that I am stepping into this role seeking to honor and to dignify. So why are we here? Why are we here in these beautiful grounds? Those are both pictures that I took that were posted on Instagram the past couple of months. Well, we're here because this is a place that was founded on a distinct idea, an idea that was shaped by history and context. It was shaped by people, it was shaped by advocates and champions, by clinicians and physicians. And it was a simple idea. It was a doctrine of kindness. It was to take the shackles off, to remove the restrictions and the bars, and to treat patients with the tenderness of genuine sympathy. We're also here at a moment in time and a cross-section in history that we did not choose. Who would have imagined that at its 200th anniversary, the IOL would be experiencing a global pandemic, unlike what the globe has experienced in its entire history? Who would have known that I would be joining this job on Zoom without sharing space and sharing human presence with all of you? Now, I shared in this morning's department meeting how in preparing for this talk, I was going through annual reports. And it almost made me emotional to see pictures of Hank and Annetta arm in arm with award winners, pictures of all of you together in the grounds and in the spaces that are often empty right now. There's so much of what we've lost in the past 2 years that shapes how we feel about this moment. But there's also something truly incredible about what it means when every assumption we had about what we can and should do is completely violated because of precedent or circumstances completely beyond our control. And we're also here because a volcano has boiled over in the past few years. Now, many of us know that the heat from this volcano has been experienced by us, our ancestors, our families, for well more beyond 2020. But it cannot be ignored that we are in a moment of national and global discomfort that's colored not only by the pandemic, but also colored by how we respond to the realization that we can be a part of a system that harms our fellow human beings, whether intentionally or unintentionally. And the question for us is, what will we do with that discomfort? In reading and researching this concept, there's a quote that describes that the greatest reforms in the care and treatment of the insane in the first half of the 19th century lay rather in the substitution of kind for cruel treatment than in scientific therapies. What I'd like us to think about is the assumptions that underpin the care we provide. What does kindness mean to us versus niceness? What does cruelty mean to us versus adverse events? And what does science and evidence mean to us? How do we develop it? And what are the different ways in which we see and understand what we think is evidence that guides the decisions that we make? Because the reality is, what we think isn't always what people who experience mental health care experience. Now, most of you know that I'm a pretty avid user of the social media platform Twitter. And just a few days ago, I came across this tweet. I'm going to read it out loud for a moment. The psych ward was devoid of normalcy. I didn't see my kids wasn't allowed outside, had no privacy or freedom, no music, friends, phone, internet, email, couldn't decide when or what to eat, sleep, not a cup of water without permission. That's not helpful. It's traumatizing. Now, this individual was not admitted to the Institute of Living. However, I've had a chance to talk to people in our communities who were admitted to the Institute of Living in the past few decades. And we have to contend with the fact that their experiences were not too dissimilar. Yes, and truthfully, for many, for most, we save their lives. We create space for them to heal. We connect them with the best of themselves, and we change their lives and transform things for them in amazing, incredible ways. But that doesn't negate the fact that we should ask ourselves whether we or our loved ones would want the experience of inpatient psychiatric care within our organization or any other. A lot of the research that I've done that's brought me to this moment, personally and professionally, suggests that what we had aspired for in terms of moral and humane treatment is not what we're delivering. For many reasons beyond our individual control as a collective, all 185 of us or anybody who's going to watch this online after. The system has led us towards disconnection and mistrust. It's a system where we function often in fear, where we consistently label one another, objectify one another, whether it's patients objectifying us or us objectifying patients. We have fallen into a quick fix culture in healthcare where we try to fix things. And if we can't, we don't like it. It doesn't feel good. And so we avoid. We lean out. We separate and distance ourselves from the discomfort and the dissonance. But we don't like it because we're human beings too. And so we consistently disconnect, dehumanize ourselves and each other, to compartmentalize who we are from what we do. And it takes a toll. And we're watching and witnessing the toll that it takes on us and our patients. So I said earlier, why are we here? And I have to invoke a great thought leader who we lost just a few days ago to say to you, we are here to awaken from the illusion of our separateness from those who we purport to serve. So something else that made me emotional when I was preparing for today's talk was when I was reading about Eli Todd, who had what people thought was pericarditis, which is what he died of, and who the patients within the retreat wrote a letter to. And I want to read to you some words from the letter that the patients wrote to the IOL's first superintendent. We, on learning that you are about to leave us for a time on account of the delicate state of your health. You have done much, sir, to alleviate one of the most formidable calamities of life. May you live to perfect and consolidate your system. We thank you for your kindness. You shall be accompanied by the warmest good wishes of your very obliged and grateful patients. Why this evoked such emotion in me is because these patients knew that he was ill. that he was fragile and that he was vulnerable. That didn't erode their trust and their appreciation of him. So we are also here, as Dr. Goodman, a resident, who's also on Twitter, would say, we are a new generation of healthcare workers who are not afraid to be vulnerable and talk about mental health. I'm filled with hope about the future of mental health in this country. So on that note, I'm going to stop, pause, and shift it over to Dr. Dewberry, who will need co-hosting rights. So if we could give those to him as well, that would be great.
Well, thank you, Javeed, very much. Just wait to share my screen. Okay. So hopefully you can see the slides that I just put up. I'm going to start with a bit of a history lesson on moral treatment. And we'll talk about the current state of moral treatment and some of what this means to me at this point, and to what Javeed was saying, why I'm here. So we need to actually step way back and talk about the pre-moral era of treatment for those with mental illness. Essentially, this was an era that extended from the 13th and 14th centuries into the 1800s. And overall, during this time in Europe, there was a lot of influence on churches on society. Monks were often involved in helping physicians in attempting to care for their patients, including attempts at caring for mental illness, which was often misunderstood as perhaps being related to the devil or to demons. And the hope was during that time that if a person could be brought closer to God, then it might be possible to cure them. And this is a famous painting sort of demonstrating some of the absurdity, actually, of some of the attempts during that time to be helpful. During that era, the first asylums were essentially homes or local jails or poorhouses, and patients were often kept locked in rooms, and if they were too difficult to manage, they might end up in a jail, or they might be kicked out of their home or town and forced to roam the countryside. And that often, led to them becoming more and more disturbed and bedraggled over time. In the 14th and 15th centuries, there were leprosy endemics in Europe, and as those endemics began to fade or recede, those hospitals were slowly converted into the first quote unquote lunatic asylums. And one of the most famous was this scene here in this image, the Bethlehem Royal Hospital, commonly known as Bedlam, founded in London, England in 1243. So it was at those asylums that there was often inhumane treatment and abuse was commonplace. And around shortly after the founding of the Institute of Living, or the Hartford Retreat, one of the first or early superintendents, Maria Brigham, seen here, wrote that of that time that they're confined in badly ventilated apartments where they are never discharged but by death. The quiet, the noisy, and the violent were all congregated together, and the majority were chained to their beds by their wrists and ankles. No contemplation of human misery ever affected us so much. The housings, the excretions, and clanking of chains gave to the place the appearance of the infernal regions. He also wrote that it was in the ignorance of the nature of insanity that those afflicted were not diseased, but were evil or wicked or in league with the devil, which gave way to further barbaric treatment during this time. And interestingly enough, he went on to found what was first called the American Journal of Insanity after his time at the Hartford retreat, and that later became the American Journal of Psychiatry. So by the mid-1780s, the French physician Philippe Pinel had begun publishing articles on the links between emotions, social conditions, and insanity. He became the chief at an asylum in Paris. And during that time, he began to really know his patients there and discovered that there was this opportunity that they could be managed by other means, essentially by sympathy and kindness. And so he began to free patients from their chains and actually forbid physical punishment. So here's a painting depicting that. His patients were allowed to move freely about the hospital grounds, and he embraced sort of the healing virtues of fresh air, exercise, and conversation with patients. And there was actually a strong emphasis on the selection of the type of staff to work in that setting, because it was understood over time that that would help facilitate the psychological work. They also, maybe in the very first precursor to the recovery movement and involving patients in care, that they began to employ ex-patients, as they were often thought of as more likely to refrain from any inhumane treatment. So it was around this time in England, same time as Pinel in France, that William Tuke, who was a Quaker, founded the York Retreat in northern England. And the approach at the York Retreat was contrasted greatly with what was going on as far as the recommended medical practices of the time, which included purging and blistering and immobilization in chains, immersion in cold baths, things like that. The retreat essentially started as a small group of patients focused with a combination of rest and talk and manual work, and centered around minimizing restraints and cultivating sort of collaboration and moral strength, so to speak. And the patients, if they behaved well, they were rewarded, and they were really involved in their treatment, and informed that their conduct would help guide their treatment. So the moral treatment practiced at the York Retreat really focused on more of a commitment to benevolence. And efforts were really made to reach patients through encouraging a sense of autonomy and not oppression. So other factors that they utilized there were really the opportunity of having prolonged observation of patients on an individual basis, which helped them to adopt new methods of care. And that led to the discovery or realization that kindness promoted patient comfort and well-being. That allaying fear was actually, through kindness, was much more effective than doing it in more traditional, previously traditional controlling manners. So Samuel Tuke spoke of promoting recovery rather than effecting a true cure. He actually recognized that just following the Hippocratic oath of do no harm was actually one of the most important contributions to recovery at that time. There was great emphasis placed on the environment as well, creating it sort of a healing space. Efforts were made to ensure that patients were not bored. And this really was the precursor to the birth of modern occupational therapy. The retreat definitely did have a religious, as founded under Quaker beliefs, there were religious undertones or maybe overtones. And patients were invited to attend services, the Bible was read, but really it focused on the humanness of patients, which was in stark contrast to the prejudice at the time. So in the US, Dorothea Dix was a nurse and school teacher, and she helped to make humane care a public and political concern. On a trip to England, she actually stayed at the York Retreat for some time and studied with them. And on return to the US, she was able to crusade and for the support of moral treatment in the US. Really took it on as far as fighting for new laws, government funding to help establish state hospitals that were designed or originally designed to honor and bring the moral treatment efforts to the US. Another figure central to the spread of moral treatment in the US was Benjamin Rush. He was a physician at the Pennsylvania Hospital, and you guys may know him or remember him as a signer of the Declaration of Independence. He was really a civic leader and social reformer. But in his work at the Pennsylvania Hospital, he really began to advocate for more humane conditions for their patients. And similar to Pinnell, required that the hospital be very sensitive to the attendants who were hired to work with the patients. The goals were really to help foster reading and talking to patients, taking them on regular walks. He also was informed by older understandings at that time of mental illness and did also attribute it to possible imbalances in the humors. And as a result of that, he still used practices like bloodletting or purgatives, or strapping patients to spinning boards. But now, as medical thought and started to shift towards the treatment of mental illness in this moral way, away from the body and including the mind, Eli Todd, as Javeed mentioned earlier, really took this on in the state of Connecticut, and he and other state physicians at the time identified the need for a facility that was reflective of this emerging thought. And in 1822, he and the Connecticut Medical Society were really passionate in convincing the state to set aside funds for the development of a hospital. And he really sought to bring moral treatment as it was started in Western Europe to the citizens of Connecticut. And when it opened in 1824, the Hartford Retreat, Todd was the first superintendent. It was the first hospital of any kind in Connecticut and one of the earliest psychiatric hospitals in the nation. So the early days of the Hartford Retreat, it was a semi-public institution, and it was focused more on a moral curative approach. It was essentially a precursor to modern psychotherapy, and with a shift in medical thought, allowing that mental disorders may have a psychological as well as a physical origin. And the goals of treatment were being, initially targeting being curative rather than custodial. And it really focused on I'll show some pictures here of, appropriate medical attention. So some of these pictures are from that, a new website coming out for the IOL at 200. So there was emphasis on psychiatric care, then establishing regimen, appropriate activities, things like that, focusing on diet and kindness, using the grounds, really enjoying the grounds of the hospital was important and thought to be curative. And I'll share a picture from last summer with some of our medical staff and enjoying the grounds in similar ways as well. So in 1843, Dr. John Butler became the superintendent, and the makeup of the patient population at the Hartford retreat slowly began to shift. There was a bigger financial burden on the retreat at the time, and the state's contributions really didn't help close that gap. And concurrently, the number of patients in the state needing treatment were rising, and this began to really overwhelm the hospital in many ways. And slowly over time, there were pressures that led to Connecticut Valley Hospital being formed, originally called Connecticut Hospital for the Insane, and that opened in 1868. Actually, ultimately, moral treatment really had a big influence on the asylum construction in the US. But unfortunately, over time, because of funding and other factors, it shifted away from the initial founding principles, because the facilities were often overcrowded or misused and run down. We've been shifting slowly back. Let's look here. So I'm going to move forward and just talk about where things, at least from my perspective, are now at the IOL. And I think we have to focus on the recovery movement that's been gaining ground over the last 20 plus years or so. And in general, in medicine, recovery has long been thought of as the end of an episode of illness, but recovery is more of, this movement is more of a general philosophy that speaks to it as a process, and it's based on progress and a personal journey rather than any set outcome. So efforts are really to help instill hope, improve relationships, foster autonomy, improve coping skills, and help with social inclusion and integration. Trauma-informed care is really a central part of the recovery movement, and it considers that really those experiencing mental illness or substance dependence or trauma are often experiencing them simultaneously and sometimes as a result of each other. And general principles of trauma-informed care include really validating the humanness of the individual and helping to foster resilience, improving resilience, and creating atmospheres where recovery is possible, so confidentiality and safe atmospheres without re-triggering past trauma. The central part of this is really involving survivors or recovered persons in service evaluation. So, as I sort of shift to closing my part of this talk, I was trying to think of what might sum things up or tie things together, and I found this great article by Glenn Gabbard, written about 4 years ago or so, and I just wanted to summarize some of the takeaways. And he's really writing about the need to preserve the person in psychiatry. And he starts with this premise that, in general, all patients seen by psychiatrists, regardless of the type of treatment, can and should be understood in psychodynamic terms. So that's often with integrating information from neurosciences and really appreciating, understanding the mind-brain connection. But psychodynamic psychiatry is essentially a biopsychosocial model. It takes or considers the influences of the environment, the person's genetic vulnerabilities or attributes, in really having a full understanding of who the patient is. So the psychodynamically informed psychiatrist really understands that it's more important to know what sort of person has a disease than to know what sort of disease the person has. And we're at risk of losing this notion of the person currently with, all the genomic data that we get, the lab tests, the brain scans, the electronic medical record makes it tough. And the goal really needs to be to preserve the person by allowing them to tell their story in a way that is unique and allows a fuller understanding of the individual to emerge. So it's also made these nice points about it's ironic that the phrase personalized medicine refers to the patient's genome rather than who they are as a person. In today's personalized medicine, it's really not, the patient or the person is not a central focus. So we really need to work towards bringing the person back. So what this all means to me, I just want to share a little bit about myself. And some of you may know that, I was born in South Africa. My father was a Baptist minister, so I'm choosing to include a picture of the chapel here on the campus of the IOL. We immigrated to Virginia when I was 8, and I was someone who, was brought up attending church, and it undoubtedly shaped my worldview. I spent a lot of time thinking about or observing how my father worked in his role as pastor, but I also observed the people who attended the churches that he led. And it was my experience that, at least at those churches, they were welcoming places and sort of safe havens for people who struggle to find a place in society. And in many ways, it was those experiences that resonated with me when I first discovered psychiatry as a third-year medical student here at the IOL. And, it really struck me that, this is a discipline in medicine that cares for the soul of the human being, much like a church might or a pastor might do as well. And continuing to sort of shape my development in this role, I've had lots of mentors and teachers along the way. Some were formal, some were informal. I just want to mention one thing that struck me when I was a resident. One of the psychiatrists really instilled in me that a good psychiatrist needed to have a broad esoteric base of knowledge, because that's what's needed to be able to connect with people. We need to be able to know a little bit about a lot of different things, because we use who we are in making these connections. Some of my other mentors are really the patients I've worked with, and I really truly feel like, I stand in awe of what they're working through. It's truly a privilege to have long-term relationships with patients, to get to know them for who they are. And they've taught me that recovery and cure are absolutely possible, even for some of the most symptomatic patients. And if they can persist in their recovery, then I can sort of certainly keep persisting in my day-to-day struggles or whatever might be getting me down in any one moment. So that's sort of how I connect this concept of recovery movement. We're all human beings with normal human difficulties, and we really have this moral obligation to do what we can to improve the care of our patients. So I'll turn it back over to you, Javeed.
Thank you so much. Excellent presentation. I tried to live tweet as much of it as I could. So check it out if anybody wants to go on Twitter. So here we are. And the question I want to ask us in the time we have left is, where do we go from here? We know that trauma changes the brain, but we also know that healing changes the brain as well. And we know that breaking this cycle of disconnection, the system that teaches us to disconnect from one another, to get back to the principles that we were founded on, is going to require speaking up and embracing the discomfort that accompanies the realization that we are not doing what we intended to do. Part of that is recognizing that we who work in the system are just as flawed and vulnerable as those we serve. It's recognizing that what we've been taught about self-disclosure and the idea that sharing vulnerability erodes trust may need to be questioned. Because if Eli Todd's vulnerability enhanced trust, what are we really doing? It's recognizing the norms that teach us to pursue a toxic culture of perfectionism, where we're all expected to do more, work harder, without making space and time to give ourselves the grace that we deserve. And it's about thinking of ways that we can share our common humanity, build trust, cultivate feedback, share power, co-design systems with those we serve, just like the pioneers of moral treatment intended. So we don't have a lot of time, and I want to take a moment just before a generative discussion to go back to the question that I had asked you earlier today, and to invite you to share your answer to that question using the Menti platform. You can go to menti.com, menti.com, on your device or your computer and enter the code 39698582 to answer what the concept of moral treatment means to you. So what we'll do is encourage people to enter, and we'll start to see people click on the screen. And while this is happening, also invite people to comment, put their hand up in the chat, and engage with us in a discussion about where we can go from here. So someone said dignity above efficiency. And I think that's one I want to lean into, because what I hope we can do is reject that one thing costs the other. I think we need to reject the idea that dignity and efficiency need to be in competition with one another, just like quality or quantity, or that the existence of one nullifies or erodes the existence of the other. And I invite anybody who'd like to speak up or unmute or share their thoughts or comments or reflections in the time that we have left. The comments should be appearing on the screen. At the end of the talk, I can collate all the comments and make sure that they're shared. Can people see the comments popping up on the screen?
Yep.
Does anyone want to comment in a different way and speak up?
Javeed, this is John. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yep, we can hear you.
Yeah. So I think we're still looking at presenter mode, which is fine. Or I don't know if you want to try to get some community going. There we go. So I first of all just want to thank you both. And I am so glad that you did it together. And it's going to take me a little while to process, because it was full in a sort of emotional showing up way, but also in I learned stuff about history I thought I already knew way, and how they kind of come together in this moment, and how extraordinary it is to have you both here as leaders on this campus. I actually do wonder, with folks, able to see each other now, and we have a few minutes, I do wonder, what this has evoked.
Go ahead, Liz.
I was just reflecting while you were talking about, we had a grand rounds a couple years ago about, I think it was called Bring Back the Asylum or something like that. But it was, kind of an argument for the ability to give people kind of longer treatment episodes if they needed. But I was thinking about the meaning of the word asylum, because I think it's only in psychiatric settings where asylum is a negative connotation. Most of the time you can seek asylum, or in a church you can seek asylum, right? So there was a lot of examples of that. And, I think I really liked the history that you went over, because it's the us versus them mentality that kind of developed this being locked in an asylum, and really kind of a betrayal, I think, of what we want to actually do, and what many people set out to do. And I appreciate the returning home to a philosophy that allows patients to feel like they can comfortably come and seek asylum rather than be thrown in an asylum. So.
Thanks so much, Annetta.
I just wanted to say, part of the history part, Hank and I were privileged some years ago to go with a group of people and visit the York retreat. And they had the most wonderful staff. We visited with their clinicians, nurses, the concepts were alive and well. A lot of the health system had taken over psychiatric care in a lot of other places. The York retreat had persisted. They were still using a lot of the original kinds of ideas. The patients that went there were often people who needed a little longer term care, but it was, a concrete example was we walked by and they said, well, of course, when we redid our units, I know we had to get safe around ligature, but we decided to leave the brew station. We're thinking brew station? Well, it was hot water for tea and all the stuff that residents could make their tea anytime they wanted. And that was one of the earliest parts of the tour. From then on, I was just wrapped with the stuff that they did a risk benefit and decided on certain things that would support people in recovery and normalcy. It was a great experience.
Thanks. Other comments? I see some in the chat. Thank you for that beautiful feedback, Kim and Catherine. Sane?
So Hank Schwartz has his hand up.
Go ahead, Hank.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you for a wonderful grand rounds, Javeed and Michael. And that was a very unusual way to do a grand rounds, and very meaningful. And one of the things about it is the vulnerability, and that sharing our vulnerability with each other all the time, and the usefulness of that, not only with our patients. I just wanted to follow up on Annetta's comment about the York retreat. They also allowed their patients to have real tableware and real glass in the glasses that that were used for drinks. And at the time, if a patient needed to go to the emergency room during the nighttime hours, the patient was accompanied by another patient, not by staff members. We learned just a few years after that the regulatory atmosphere of safety first in Great Britain had actually taken over, and they were no longer allowed to do that. They were slowly being chipped away in the value system of patient dignity first, patient responsibility and accountability for the individual first, by the regulatory regime, which is one of the issues that we will clearly have to struggle against if we're going to move in the kind of direction that you want to move us in.
Thanks for that. And thanks for your feedback and your support and mentorship as I've stepped into my role. I really appreciate it, because we have to realize that part of what's shaping or pushing us perhaps a bit astray is the litigiousness, if that's a word, of contemporary healthcare, the risk-averse nature of healthcare organizations across the US, and how we can actually leverage these systems in ways that honor and go back to the original intent of what we're supposed to do. I think there's an acknowledgement that needs to happen of the ways in which such culture and regulation are interpreted in practice, because they're not always interpreted in accordance with what the letter of the law may say, and how we shape the identity of the organization, but also build policy with patients, caregivers, and recovery support specialists. I think an inclusive approach to our policies is going to help us really critically ask how much of what we do in terms of regulation is self-protective, that we can acknowledge and accept based on the letter of the law, but also how much of what we do we can actually potentially change. Ellen, go ahead.
Yeah, no, just first of all, this was so wonderful. Thank you both so much. And, kind of similar to what Annette and Hank have shared, when I came here in '82, I'd come from Shepherd Pratt Hospital, which was a very similar type of older psychiatric hospital, very large and very much into moral treatment as well. And when I came here, we were using real silverware and I was cooking with patients, and it was really like it was at maybe York Retreat to some extent. And we had all that. And, having grown up here really in my psychiatric nursing career, what keeps me going is the fact that despite the regulatory, and that is definitely a variable here that has changed us and made us have to change in many ways. But I still think, again, what keeps me going is that we can still do things to keep that moral treatment and dignity and respect, whether it's, again, letting people have cell phones, letting people have juice machines on the unit, making the outdoor space better. There's so much we can still do. And I'm just so excited that we're talking about this, because I think especially with the pandemic, hopefully as that winds down, hopefully, we can really focus back on what we can do versus what we can't, because I think that's a balance all the time. So I just really overwhelmed with just hearing everything, and it just really, really a great talk. So thank you.
You're welcome. I know it's 1 o'clock and I'm going to go right to you, Peter, in a second. But before people drop off, I did want to just say that starting in the spring, we're going to be holding a series of focus groups led by Paul Simeone and the Lean team, where people will, from all parts of the IOL, will be invited to come, participate, and actually help us co-write this next chapter. So please look for that call. This will not end today. We will be deliberate about engaging you all in building and honing where we want to go and how we're going to get there. Go ahead, Peter. You're muted, so we can't hear you yet.
This is a wonderful Grand Rounds. Thank you. I've been here long enough so I can remember the Institute's sesquicentennial celebration, the 150th anniversary. We were a much bigger hospital then. We had open and closed units. Patients could move around with grounds cards and also could, with authorization from their doctors, have town passes and go into town. So there wasn't as much conservatism and worry about risk, although we certainly thought about it a lot. But over that time until now, what's kept me here in large part is the community, both of patients and staff, of which I very felt much a part of. And it meant a great deal to me professionally. I think we've had hard times over the last 2 years because of COVID, but I'm hoping we can get back to that kind of feeling of community that I've experienced for most of my career.
So important. I completely agree. The other Peter Sugarman, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, Mike, I didn't know all that about you. As was said, the vulnerability that both of you have shown in this talk is cherished. Thank you. I just wanted to say that I think it falls on us to have the inner strength to practice moral treatment in an environment that discourages moral treatment. Although, for example, hospitalization is, people don't get admitted unless they are unsafe. And you could just say, well, we have to do everything we can to keep people safe. But I think treatment is so much more than that. This needs to be, something that comes from inside us. The environment is, well, it's not our enemy, but it discourages what we want to do.
I completely agree with you. And that's why to move forward, we need to think about not just individual level change, but structural change. What are the attributes of the environment that drive it? What are the attributes that are within our realm of influence? And what are our assumptions about things like risk and safety? Because I can be very open and candid with you all. A lot of my personal experiences have really reinforced that risk can never be completely prevented. We think of, those of us that are parents, when we let our kids out into the world, we let them step out knowing that the risk exists of them falling, but we're there with our arms ready to catch them. But we don't hold them too tight. And we know that if we do, the effects of that can be quite harmful in terms of their development of their personality. And so how can we, within the confines of existing laws and legislation, think about risk in ways that really centers the choice and autonomy of the individual coming into the organization, and really redesign the system through their eyes, recognizing that if they're safe, we're safe. And if we are feeling safe, they are feeling safe. To do that, we need to reject some of the zero-sum thinking that has become commonplace about patient versus staff safety. We need to rethink fundamentally our use of restraint and seclusion in a way that is truer to the principles upon which we were founded. Dahlia, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to weigh in. I can't help but think about the 6 months that I spent in New Zealand at an inpatient unit, which it was a cottage with an open door and an open back door. And it is where the sickest patients were, and they were there for a very long time. And it was sort of illegal to lock the door, and there were only 3 or 4 beds that were intensive care where patients for a couple of days at a time. And we're dealing with the same psychiatric pathology. And I think there's a reflection of culture in everything that we do. In thinking about risk and safety for patients, but then also the burnout and the meaninglessness, or the sense of meaninglessness, perhaps, or the creeping of a sense of, sort of existential emptiness that providers are experiencing, I wonder if maybe some of what happened is that we relied a little too much on being up here in our engagement, in having checklists and organizations that were founded with all of the good intentions, you know, JCO and ACGME, and then we became enslaved by these checklists and these valuing of the measurable and the reductionistic in such a way that now all of society is rejecting it to some degree. And so it would be great if at the IOL, we could be at the front end of some of that questioning of the role or the place for checklists and you know, treatment plans that are far, they're not divorced completely, but far from the experience, you know, so remote from the experience of who the patient is and who we are and what we're actually seeing, and go back to some of what was working. I mean, it's happening in all sorts of things, from like clothing sizes to research. You know, there's a whole questioning now of the sort of the absolute truth of a double-blind, placebo-controlled standard for research or for relying on measurables and data. And I think there's certainly space for that in clinical care. So that'd be great if we raised our voices towards that.
Yeah, I agree completely. And I think there's two pieces to it. One is this pandemic has shattered what's acceptable and unacceptable in that regard. It's shattered assumptions about what it means around workforce, around surge, around planning. If we can erect field hospitals and temporary structures because of an infectious respiratory illness, why can't we find a way to invest so that kids aren't waiting for days in CCMC's emergency department for beds, right? So I think we can be leaders, we can be thought leaders in asking those questions. But I also think that our history has suggested that we can at times view ourselves or position ourselves in ways that may be adversarial to other systems. And I would actually say we are burning too much energy counterproductively in that kind of us versus them thinking. We are part of the system. And therefore we can speak up and be part of change in that system. We have just as an important voice in that system being south of Retreat Avenue versus north of Retreat Avenue. So we shouldn't hesitate to embrace ourselves as part of an organization, as part of a system that's one of the largest in the country, to demonstrate the clear case for why centering humanity is part of being a high-performing, efficient, financially sound health system, because we all know it is. Yes, I see a hand, Peter.
Yes, I wanted to follow up on what Dr. Zeman was saying. I'm also the third Peter on the screen, and I haven't said anything yet. Remembering back to the days of the open units and the closed units, another evolution at the Institute was back in 1990 when the inpatient units started to downsize and lengths of stay decreased, is we started residential programs, and we still have Eli's Retreat and the Todd House. But there were several more over the years, and those really represented an intersection between treatment and home and even family, because for some of our patients who had really disturbed relationships with their families, the residents became a family. And it was, they got formal treatment in day treatment programs and with therapists, but it continued really 24/7 in that kind of supportive environment. And that's something we're still doing. And I think is a very valuable modality for some of our patients.
Yeah, it's stories like that that actually give me the hope and make us excited, because we've done it. We know it, right? It's not something different that we're disconnected from. We know the heart of what we need to get back to, and how we consider family and become family-centered, consider community and become more open and inclusive, and how we deliver care is going to be part of it. I think, Hank, I saw your hand as well.
Well, yeah, so this is a controversial comment or question, and I'm a little unsure as to whether I should be making this comment or delivering this question, but I will. In light of the implications of this discussion for our acting with issues of patient autonomy and dignity in the forefront, but also with our pushing somewhat against the risk bureaucracy. What are the implications going forward, long-term, this is not a short-term change, for our tolerance for suicide risk?
Well, that's one that I don't think I have an answer to, and I don't think we all have an answer to. But I do think that that's one of the key and core questions about a central human issue that relates to the implications of how we do what we do. So I do think that we don't need to fall into any cookie cutter way of approaching how to answer that question. I think we need to really dig deep and think about evidence, science, history, tradition, and where and how we approach suicide risk, because it really becomes, in an organization like ours, the central issue that can influence or sensitize us to fear in our decision making, in our engagement with one another, and in our practice and how we design models of care. So I think let's take that dissonance that you helped provoke for us, and let's create even more space to talk about that. Godfrey?
Yeah, just very briefly, thank you both so much for reminding us of our core values here. I think that was super and very different. I just wanted to challenge this sort of unspoken assumption that we have, or a false dichotomy, that the biopsychosocial model forces us to pick sides. It's one of these us versus them things. So all of our patients are people, and we have to address that. And they're people in bodies with brains. As people have said, that trauma and healing and even talking to someone changes their brain. And all this is occurring in a social context, and you really can't neglect any of that. We just need better ways to weave those things together, and not to look at them as separate entities somehow, and you address one and not the other. You have to address all of them. Just wanted to leave it at that.
Thank you. Thanks for your comments. Sam, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much for the talk. One thing I took away from it is that, and this is something I really believe, and I think is reflected in research too, is that humanization, connection, and understanding are treatments in and of themselves. And my hope is that we can kind of put these on par with more medical-based treatments, because really the lack of those things, I think, is what is at the root of a lot of mental illnesses. I guess my question is there any kind of drive towards that? Is there anything kind of happening that will sort of not just put those things on, view them as something that is required as sort of part of medical treatment, but as a treatment in and of itself?
It's a great point, and I'm going to share just my own thoughts about it, but invite others to share it. I think that it's been fascinating for me throughout my career, as I've separated from the ivory tower and gone out into communities, how much critique I've heard of what people think is the medical model versus what I was trained as the medical model. I was privileged to be trained to center connection and talking and humanity as an essentially medical intervention, on par, if not greater than, the prescription of medication or procedures. So I would say, for me personally, it's back to, it's not medical versus non-medical. It's really about us, right? It's us as a team, as a group, and it's about what we decide and how we move forward in terms of centering the things that matter that we know are effective versus staying restricted to just one way of viewing and seeing the world. And for me personally, you know, I have a PhD in an education, in addition to my doctorate in medicine. So I do think we need to bring some interdisciplinarity to our approach, and really celebrate and honor and amplify the interprofessional, multi-professional nature of how we practice and who we are. So we're 1 minute over. My apologies. I do hope this has generated thoughts and reflections. Please reach out, comment, participate, and engage when we get into this exercise of the focus groups. And let us know, Dr. Dewberry, how we did. This was a bit tricky for both of us to try to stitch this together in a way that was both evocative, but also hopeful. So thank you so much. Take care and see you all soon.